Welcome to the Systemic Lives podcast with me, Shila Rashid. And I am absolutely delighted to have a very special guest today, Froma Walsh. Froma, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Froma, we're going to hear a bit about you. As you know, the Systemic Lives podcasts are a conversation about your personal and your professional kind of trajectories and journeys. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for our listeners to hear more about you, which is not just about the professional in the way that they know you professionally. Of course, you are an amazing scholar and you have contributed immensely to the systemic field. And you're most well known for your work around resilience, which is a really important area, topic, subject, lived experience. There's so many ways in which to describe that. And before we go a bit more into your professional kind of experiences and what you're known for, I'd really love to hear a bit more about you. And so it would be, I guess I'm really curious, firstly, about where you were born and the time that you were born, what was happening for maybe your parents around the time you were born.
Ah, well, that's quite a story in itself. Um, I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is a small factory town just over the border north of Chicago.
Mhm.
So I'm a Midwestern girl at heart, like Virginia Satir, although she grew up on a farm. Um, and I was born and raised in that small town on the wrong side of the tracks. Um, and that's a story in that my parents had a lot of financial hardship. It was really a struggle. I was born in 1942, so it was just the beginning for the U.S. involvement in World War II.
Mhm.
And I remember my mother telling me that those first few years, as a special anniversary gift or a holiday gift, my dad would buy her a pair of silk hose because they were very hard to find in those days. So I grew up, but the thing is, it all seemed normal to me because in my community, um, it was really a middle class way of life, small bungalow houses, uh, very little, there was no crime. I could ride my bike around town. And in my neighborhood, it was very family oriented and very community oriented. Um, my dad had lost everything during the Great Depression. He was working to become a pharmacist, and the pharmacy school closed. He had a job for a pharmacist in a drugstore, and then that pharmacy, although the owner said to him, "I don't have any sons, so I'll leave the business to you when I retire." The pharmacy closed during the Depression. So growing up, there was a struggle financially. My dad acquired a little gas station in Kenosha.
Mhm.
Uh, and unfortunately, they built a new main road between Milwaukee and Chicago, and it didn't pass by the station anymore.
Right.
So um, it was really a struggle financially. My mother came from a very different background. She was French Canadian, Catholic background. My father came from a Jewish Ashkenazi background in Budapest and Odessa. And when they came together, they just, you know, had no problems with that. Um, and my mother had been a classical musician, a pianist.
Mhm.
And so she opened, we did what we could in those days. She opened a music studio and taught piano lessons, gave small concerts around the state,
Wow. Mhm.
and was a part-time teacher. So um, I grew up in a family that really buffered the stresses and strains that we had financially,
Mhm.
and they raised me lovingly. And so I'm very grateful to my parents for that.
Mhm.
And I should just add that it wasn't really until my adulthood and coming up through everything that I came to the concept of resilience and really learned that my family had been so resilient during that time because I had never seen it in that way. I was in departments of psychiatry and mental health systems that, just look for family dysfunction and labeling. And I think so that my family upbringing is really the foundation on all the work I've done in my life.
Yes, it sort of that what you were describing in those experiences of your parents, how there were so many struggles, but you also spoke about the sort of sense of feeling buffered, by your family, by your community, at a time when there was actually, it sort of sounds like there were huge adversities going on around your family, around your community, and also globally with the war as well, the Second World War at that time. But something about how you were learning resilience, it sounds like at a very young age from the ways that your parents were learning it and maybe modeling it in some ways for you. I
But
was
it's interesting because we use the term lived experience now. And as a child, it just, we struggled. My parents, even when they had to restart in Kenosha from Chicago, I was just 2 years old. And the night that I was having my tonsils out, there was a fire in our building and it destroyed everything they had. So just as they were starting to rebuild, again, they lost everything.
Mhm,
Um, and so we really, we use the word unhoused now, which is, I think, kind of a strange word, but we really were taken in
mhm,
by community members during a prolonged period of time until we could manage to get our own place to live.
mhm,
And there's something about my work with families where I am very cautious about all these risk factors in childhood because I really saw how each time it was hard. My parents struggled a lot, but how they really persevered
mhm,
and they really did their best. And when they finally realized, I was just in about 15, that there really wasn't any way to get above that, they remade their lives. I think it was my mother who finally got my father to say, let's go out to California. That's where everybody goes to have a new life. So there's also something about the American dream, I guess, that you
mhm,
go west and, if you can't make it, you start anew. And
mhm,
that's what
mhm,
they did. And it took a while for my dad to get a job, to get a footing. And, so I, luckily, because it was just an adventure going to this new place,
mhm,
um, found myself a Californian and was able to go then to college at Berkeley, University of California, for $250 a semester. So
Not what it would
it,
cost now.
no, I no, it was a time when things were financially affordable
Mhm,
for people that were in more of a blue collar middle class.
mhm,
And I can understand much better why today there's a sense of we can't make it anymore. I get that.
mhm. So the sort of real kind of theme of uh this sense of being able to start afresh, a new renewal, and I can see some of the way you language how you experienced it. You were talking about it being as a sense of adventure at a time when your parents were also starting again, going away from the community that they knew. I was wondering about your siblings. Did you have any siblings? No, are you the only child?
Uh, I was an only child. My parents married a little later.
Mhm.
Um, but I had my dog Rusty.
Right.
And that's why I've always been very much a pet lover. I don't know if you know, but I've written two articles when my dear friend and colleague Evan Imber Black
Mhm.
was the editor of Family Process. She would talk about her cats, and I would talk about my dogs. And she said, "Froma, you've got to write about pets because nobody's paying attention." So I ended up writing two articles for a special section
Right.
on the human animal bond, which, even though I wrote that more than 10 years ago, apparently this is a growing field now. And it's people are still looking at what's the significance for attachment, for adversity, for resilience of companion animals. So yes, it
Absolutely.
was my dog Rusty.
So you really interweaved your kind of experiences, your lived experiences, as you were talking about
Absolutely.
earlier, with your professional, and of course, pets are so incredibly important, to families. They are part of the family, and so you were again a real kind of pioneer in a trailblazer in some ways, uh, in kind of thinking about including pets as part of what kind of not only helped people feel connected and maybe less isolated, less alone, but also as really important kind of ways to cope and manage with difficulties too. So you had Rusty as your companion, and I'm wondering when there was the four of you and you were growing up, are there particular kind of memories of, say, like dinner table conversations or particular kind of events or moments in your family that really stood out for you in terms of what you kind of took away in terms of values or things that were important to your parents that you think they kind of gave to you or handed down to you?
Mhm. Well, it's funny, and I'm now at the life stage when I just wrote a final professional book on working with loss, complex and traumatic loss. Um, but I think I I never saw myself as a trailblazer. It was more that, and Monica McGoldrick and I have had many, many conversations about this, about life transitions. And I think um, I'm now writing more about my mother, about my dad, about their lives. What I needed to do was I needed to understand them, who they were as persons, because as a child, I it was just everyday life. And um, I would say and the other thing that I've written about is spirituality.
Mhm.
And that would have been the last thing in the world I would have written about because it was very complicated in my family. Um, my mother, as I said, came from a French Canadian Catholic family.
Mhm.
We didn't see them much. They were in Montreal and up in the UP. And so we saw my dad's Jewish family a lot, but they had come very early in the 1880s, and they were German speaking, and they had much more of a secular, but maybe more of an ethnic identity than a religious identity.
Mhm.
So, uh, although when my mother married my dad, um, when I was born, she converted to Judaism.
Mhm.
And she said it was very easy for her because it was also part of the foundation of Christianity.
Mhm.
So she felt like she was going back to, kind of the bedrock, the basics of it. And so there was something about my parents, they never preached. There was no, they didn't fight or argue. So I'm not very good in families that have a lot of conflict. And it might also be I'm a Midwestern girl. So they never explained or pronounced to me. It was kind of just the way they were.
Hmm.
So my mother, because she was an organist, became the organist for the Jewish temple, the Reformed
Right.
Jewish temple.
Hmm.
And so I would go to services with her, but my dad didn't go because he had to work. And so there I was with my mother, the organist. But eventually it came to a place where um, she was uh, in somebody in the community said, well, anyway, that she wasn't really Jewish, even though she had converted.
Hmm.
And my parents, they just said, we're organized religion, maybe not so much for us, but they remain very deeply spiritual.
Hmm.
And I can't tell you what that was, but there was something that they gave me in the way that they, without pronouncing or it was never said, but life was all about knitting together diverse elements, challenges, and overcoming. There was something about it being an integration that was never seamless.
Hmm.
That led me, I would say, in my career, that I'm never completely in one church or another,
Yes.
but I feel that we are all part of a larger community
Hmm.
with shared values, with shared commitments and beliefs, so that when I got to spirituality in my work, many decades later, and after my mother had passed away, as I told her, I don't think religion is very important in my life.
Hmm.
After college, I should mention this because it was really important. Um, I was deciding between graduate school and the Peace Corps.
Hmm.
John F. Kennedy was the president. He had just been assassinated.
Right.
And I went into the Peace Corps and lived and worked in Morocco for 2 years,
Hmm.
an Islamic society that I really came to love, like another home for myself. So when I came back and I started to work, I started thinking about spirituality in a broader way, as a place of multiplicity,
Hmm.
just like my own background of I had these different, completely unintegrated
Yeah.
parts. So that even in family therapy, when I got to that, it was never about which school am I in, or am I a narrative, or am I a this, or am I a that, but really always thinking about what's of value for me and in my work and in my practice that I draw upon from different traditions, different new developments in the
Hmm.
field, and trying to be open to this is interesting. Oh, I'm curious about this. How might this have value? So I would say I don't identify very well with anything. And it's hard to say, yeah, I'm just always feeling like I'm maybe at home in the world is the best way I can say
Mm,
about it.
mm. You're using that word knitting, and it's very interesting that you were talking about these different elements of your parents in terms of their sort of their background, your mother being French Canadian, your father coming from Budapest, or his family coming from Budapest, the different religions, and the different places that they inhabited. Something about that knitting that you were talking about, sort of that trying to make sense of really very different cultural kind of
Mhm.
backgrounds, and also in terms of the way your parents were. So your father, you were talking about him working in the garage, being a pharmacist, sort of maybe having a much more practical kind of orientation. And there's your mother, who's very creative, a musician, and sort of giving recitals. I wonder how that impacted on you as a adolescence growing up. You were describing yourself as a Midwestern girl, and I was wondering what that meant, what that looked like. What were you like as a girl, as an adolescent? What kind of music were you listening to? What did you wear? What? What were you like?
I don't know. I still have friends, and that's part of, maybe it's a stitching together. I have friends from every place and every stage of my life that I keep in touch with today.
Mhm.
Because maybe it's over time too. It's like those touchstones. I just just a couple days ago, I emailed an old boyfriend from high school who we're dear friends now, and I see him and his wife, and they visited us. Um, and because I had come across a radio show I used to listen to when I came home from school between Thanksgiving and Christmas called The Cinnamon Bear. And I found it, and it's still playing in some rural parts of the United States. And so I said, did you ever listen to this in California when you were 8 years old? And I said, but no, you were a boy in California. You were probably outdoors playing. And I was in the snows of Wisconsin, coming in from the cold, listening to the Cinnamon Bear. So I value memory a lot, and I value connection a lot across time and space. Um, but I should add something because it's important.
Do.
When I said I needed to know more about my parents and who they were, um, I it wasn't until I was in my training uh, and I first met Monica
Mhm.
and my other dear friend Carol Anderson. I was in New Haven at Yale in Department of Psychiatry training,
How old were
and
you then,
I
Proma?
was I was a couple years older, so I was late 20s, I guess. And my mother, I didn't know, my mother had a serious illness, and it was aplastic anemia, and I'd never heard of it. They were in my parents were in California. I was on the East Coast. And it's a terrible thing when I was an only child. And what do? You just keep flying out there and you stay, but you can't hover. You don't know it's a long-term condition. And then she went into a coma and died.
I'm sorry to
And
hear that.
yeah, and in those years, we always thought, oh, young adults, it was this model, this terrible model of you march through the life cycle. And you detach from your family of origin, you're independent. Um, and I was involved during the illness. I remember my grandmother wrote to me and said, your mother is ill. How can you be taking care of strangers and not come home and take care of her? Oh, that just
Very
tugs it.
hard.
But
How did
in
you deal with
America,
that?
America, and I think in Great Britain, we also, you went on with your life. You soldiered on. I mean, soldiering on maybe was in my family. It's like, no, I'll just try to do both and I'll try to go back and forth. And when she died, I came right back to my work. I had a full caseload. There was no bereavement care.
Mm-hmm.
And people didn't even say, I'm sorry for your loss, which is the very, very least people say now. And I was expected to just carry on. And so the grief just was suppressed. I don't know. It was minimal. And I remember I was engaged at that time. Or no, actually, I had just been married, and I went to my in-laws for dinner a few weeks after I'd gone out to her funeral, and they didn't mention it, and the whole dinner, and that's how it was in our country. It's like, and I didn't think much of it, except I knew that they didn't want to upset me.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to make a nice dinner for me. They wanted me to feel better.
Mm-hmm.
It was nourishing. And they were doing something that meant well. And I guess I've always, because of my parents, this is the way they were, I always assume good intentions.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
So
I,
the
yeah,
silencing, the sort of
well,
not
that's just
talking
the way,
about it. Did you
exactly.
see
It's
that as
just
a
the
form
way
of protection?
it's just the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
But Monica and I
Mhm.
started to become fast friends, and she had just lost somebody who was very dear to her in her life.
Mhm.
My mother had just died, and we started noticing a lot of issues
Mhm.
of unattended loss in the work we were doing.
Mhm.
And she was in one setting and I was in another. I moved to Chicago shortly after that. And it was a conversation. And we started to think and write about that. And that's when we did our first, we did some articles, and we were really taken by the work of Murray Bowen and Norman Paul, because they were the only ones in our field that noticed that families that don't attend to death and loss, and they don't help their children with it, that
Mhm.
there are complications that ripple over time.
Mhm.
So Monica and I did a book together, Living Beyond Loss.
Mhm.
And I mention that now because how many decades later?
What
I
do
don't
you
know.
think that,
I can't count anymore.
what do you
But
think
I
that
have to,
the,
no. Oh, I
sorry.
want to say that this is a thread that became the most important clinically in my work, so that while I'm most known for changing families and family resilience, it's mostly in application where there is profound and complicated loss. So just last year, I wrote my final book on loss and resilience because um, it's still not widely addressed in training and in practice.
Mm,
Okay,
no.
that's all I wanted to
No,
say.
no, no, no. It's really, it sounds very poignant, what you're saying, because you started to talk about this part of your memory, because you were saying something about, your wish to understand your parents, and you were talking about that, and
Yeah.
but also at the same time, I guess, you were also talking about that very profound sense of loss of your mother, and how it sort of again weaved into your work. But just before I maybe ask a little bit more about the book and about your kind of work around loss, I'm wondering, sort of, there you were in that, again, sort of like a cusp of entering a different kind of a life stage, which was you getting married, and at the same time you were facing the loss of your mother. And I was wondering about your father, and you were talking about that, sort of trying to hold on to some kind of normalcy, and just kind of get on with work, with your personal life. I was wondering what happened with your father, and sort of the connection with your father as well as you were going along in this journey.
Yeah. Well, uh, that that was really significant because first of all, just before my mother died, I it's like it sparked me. I think young people aren't so curious about who their parents were. It's like, this is who I knew growing up, and I'm carrying all these, disappointments or angers or regrets or whatever. Um, but I asked her more about her early young adult period because I never heard about it. I heard about her happy childhood, and then I knew my parents. And I was pretty shocked when she said, well, I guess I can tell you, but I went to Catholic girls' school, and my cousin Georgina and I both joined the convent, and I was a nun for
Mhm.
17 years.
17 years.
17 years. So here I am, like 28 years old, and my mother is telling me that she was a nun for 17 years. So it was,
Family secrets.
how do you even start to, I mean, okay. And luckily, both Monica and I, we met because we were both in therapy with a Jungian psychiatrist.
Right.
So very fortunately, my Jungian psychiatrist just did the best contextualizing and framing of that, and not as, oh my God, but how courageous that was of your mother to have left because she wanted a normal life.
Mhm.
They didn't do that in those days. You need to learn more about your mother. And then unfortunately, I had to do that on my own,
Mhm.
after she passed away, which is why I do value family of origin work for people who have lost their parents, because there's so many ways that we can get to know our parents,
Mhm.
even when they're no longer here in our presence in everyday life. So that that led me, to and then she said, "But don't tell your father, because I never told him."
Ah,
And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, I was afraid because his family was Jewish that they wouldn't accept me. It was just too much."
mhm.
And so again, it was like, oh, okay, I get that. I understand that.
Mhm.
Uh, but after a couple of years, I did tell my father because Monica pestered me to tell my father.
Right.
And, Evan, my dear friend, and this is where our colleagues are valuable.
Yes,
Evan did a lot of work on family secrets.
that's right.
And,
Yes.
her mantra always, because Evan and I were very close friends in college, it all depends what you do with a secret, whether you tell, who it's going to affect, all of that.
Mhm.
So I told my dad, and because I thought, he's not going to get upset. I know my dad, he's very accepting.
Mhm.
And he said, first he didn't believe it. And then he said, well, I don't know why she didn't tell me. It wouldn't have made any difference for me. And here my mother had kept that secret all these years
Mhm.
because she was afraid of not being accepted.
Mhm.
That people hold deep parts of themselves out of fear of rejection. If
Yeah.
they knew this about me,
Mhm.
they wouldn't accept me.
Yes.
Then I realized I better learn more about my dad too,
Mhm.
because he was the one I had the harder time with.
Mhm.
And Monica was a great help to me for a couple of years, because I really thought, you know, if because I didn't go out to visit my dad for a few years after my mother died. Um, I was still angry about some things from childhood, and mostly about just the hardship financially, um, and uh, and I thought to myself, well, how can I believe that family therapy, that people can change, when I believe that my father is hopeless?
Mhm.
So, how can I think my own father is hopeless and really have this core conviction that people can change? And so I began that work. And Monica, bless her heart, she drove out with me to California. She had some relatives to see, but she wanted to meet my father. And then she said, well, he's not so bad. He's kind of like him. And I had to then find out. And what I learned about both of my parents, my mother's father had died when she was 17 in a horrible, traumatic train crash.
My goodness.
And and so I began to research that and find out about her terrible loss.
Mhm.
And then when she came out of the, the sisterhood of the order, her mother, in the 1930s, you married, like you were in when you became a nun, that was for life. And it was a terrible shame for a family.
Mhm.
And her mother refused to see her or talk to her and died of a stroke 6 months later. So here in my own family, I had these traumatic losses
Mhm.
that my mother carried in her
Mhm.
and that I never understood. And I think, coming to learn that really deepened my own work with loss.
Mhm. Sort of lots of sort of legacies
Yeah,
that were
exactly.
kind of there in the background that kind of impacted on both your parents. Um, and yet you were not aware of, but maybe you experienced in some kind of a lived way, but couldn't quite piece things together until much later. So
Exactly.
yeah, I'm just wondering, what those kind of legacies of losses, but also their courage, because you speak about the courage that your parents also had to start over. What do you think that gave to you as you were sort of going into your own life as a young adult, those kind of different strands of, having really struggled, suffered, and yet also they sounded like they're incredibly brave as well.
I guess it normalized hardship,
Mhm,
that life isn't easy.
mhm,
It gave me compassion for people who have even tougher times. Uh, I would say my 2 years in Morocco were the most profound years because I worked with young girls and women. I worked with street children in, in rehabilitation services. I mean, just, I wasn't, we were Peace Corps volunteers, but because of my background as an undergrad in psychology, we were working in that area. But I saw people who had very little in terms of, financial, but the resources they had in extended family relationships
mhm,
and in their faith and the value of Islam in everyday life in helping them. I think those were really powerful for me in coming back home and looking at our nuclear families and the loss of extended families and how um, we didn't have all of those connections that can support people through hardship,
mhm,
or how in the US, it was really the Black church that was that connection for African Americans through slavery and Reconstruction and beyond.
mhm,
And it just gave me a greater depth of understanding of the importance of systemic work that goes beyond the individual and let's just reduce symptoms and do functioning, but we have to really look at how can we build family supports, how can we look for and enlarge supports that are social and economic and healthcare and other kinds of resources in the community. So I would just say that systemic practice is my home, and that's to me what we need to be doing.
mm. I mean, it. I'm sort of thinking about how you coming from quite a tight-knit family with your mom and dad being the only child, and then with Rusty, going
And my
from
grandparents, my
yeah,
grandparents.
and your grandparents, but also this kind of sense of kind of, I think you said the word stitching, sort of collecting friends from different parts of your life who you still have now. And I was thinking about how Monica McGoldrick and Evan Ember Black, in some ways, where they become your siblings, your professional siblings, of course, but there were some of the people that it sounds like there were things that you were really trying to figure out, and through conversations with them and maybe with others, there was something about an ability for you to kind of come to different understandings about your own life. Is that sort of something that you think happened with?
Yeah, I would say more than that,
Mhm,
actually. I like the word kinship
mhm.
because some people aren't close to their siblings at all.
No.
And siblings can be, have a lot of conflict. But there's something about the kinship that's friendship, collegiality, but there's also gender
Mhm,
that comes into this. And I think that was another piece that really was strong to be. First of all, my mother wasn't like the other homemakers in the 1950s with the apron and being at home with my dad coming in. They didn't have the traditional gender roles.
mhm,
And they always valued for me as a girl, as a daughter, that I was smart and I would go to college. Of course, I didn't know at the end of college, you try to drop off, then what? And I guess at those days, my friends got married and had children because in those days it was still what women did. But I think going into the Peace Corps and then was in the anti-war movement and political activism and coming into family therapy, that there were women that we became very close, both in terms of supporting each other in terms of courage, in terms of uh, inviting each other to do things that we were involved in and taking risks and knowing that they would catch us.
Hmm. A real kind of support, a support
Yeah,
structure
yeah.
and a cushion almost,
Um,
an
but
emotional.
yeah, not so much. Yes, yes, and there was something though intellectual and professional in saying in encouraging our work.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I want to mention my dearest friend Celia Falikov.
Right.
Uh, if you want to interview her,
Would
she
love.
just my heart. And Celia and I think, you know, it's serendipity how sometimes we meet. So I was in Chicago and I was visiting my Peace Corps roommate who also lived in Chicago.
Mhm.
And she lived in a three flat on the top floor. And we were saying goodbye, and she was walking me down, and she said, "Oh, you might like to meet my neighbor on the ground floor, Jill Metcalf. She's a videographer, but she works with some family therapists. She was Carl Whitaker's videographer."
Oh my goodness.
And sitting on the porch with her was Celia Falikov, her friend. And we met, and right away we started talking
Mhm.
about our work, about family therapy. And we were each trying to publish our first article. And mine had been rejected by a psychiatry journal.
Mhm.
Um, and hers was her dissertation, and she was just frozen. And we met on a monthly basis and we read each other. It wasn't like emotional support group.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
was like, send me your draft. I'll review it for you. We were reviewing each other's manuscripts, giving each other ideas.
Amazing.
We each published our first articles. Mine was in Family Process
Mhm.
in 1976. It was my master's thesis. And Celia published hers. And we went on. We still to this day send each other our manuscripts for comments.
So a real
So there's something about,
creative, yeah, those you use the word kinship, but those kind of really nurturing, nourishing kind of relationships, intellectual kind of stimulation, create, very, very creative, where you were kind of really supporting each other to kind of achieve your kind of there's something very kind of you were talking about that serendipity, but something really quite sort of um, exciting, invigorating about the coming together of these different kind of minds. And you were talking, and you said it's interesting that it was mostly women because I was also thinking about what happened to the men? Were there any kind of connections with the family therapists who were men at that time, and how did they take your influence and your kind of solidity, if you like, at that time?
well, Monica and I have had some conversations about mentors because in those days, men were in charge of everything and men were advanced. And that's why I don't like the word support so much. Yes, we supported each other, but also we encourage, I'd like the word encouraged
Mhm.
better because men wouldn't say, ah, he supported me.
Hmm.
They wouldn't say that.
Right.
They would probably not even notice
Hmm.
that there was a senior man who opened the door for them
Do you
or
think
who,
it kind of diminishes that word support
as
diminishes
women,
kind
yeah,
of,
women, it's about support. It's
yes.
about emotional support. No, it's like Monica, a good example. Well, but I want to talk about gender
Okay. Yes, no, I can hear about that gender.
because
Go
this
ahead.
is, I first became aware really of it in Morocco because of course you would go out in rural areas. Well, we knew about, women were at home, they were raising children, and they at that time they wore a veil in Morocco to go out. But because of the French influence and Western influence, as soon as they got indoors, they had, Western factions and lipstick and the whole thing, and they did kind of a duality, but yet the power and privilege, like if you went out in rural areas, the man would be riding a donkey and the woman would be carrying loads on her head and plus children on her side. So I first, became aware that yes, it isn't just different spheres, but you know, the oppression that women would eat after everyone else and whatever was left. But it was then in the field, I was in, I started becoming aware of gender in couple relationships in the late 60s and in our own field where we would have conversations at the forefront of it was alternative psychiatry. And we were at the forefront, and it was who was that Brit who did
R.D.
he
Lang?
Yes, R.D. Lang. Thank
Yes.
you. So
Hmm.
we were reading R.D. Lang. We were having meetings about how we were going to transform psychiatry.
Hmm.
And, we just, we were all excited. And we'd have dinner. And then the women would go in the kitchen and clean up, and the men would go in the living room and continue the conversation. And then the women started saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? So in the early uh, alternative and progressive movement,
Hmm.
we started noticing these disparities. And then, of course, when they came into our field, they were in families and they were in family therapy. So Carol Anderson, Monica McGoldrick, and I put together. It was called the Stonehenge Conference
Hmm.
for women. We invited, I think, 50 women who were doing really interesting and important work in family therapy, just to gather together and to share the work that we were doing.
Hmm.
And wow, there was a reactivity in the field. The men thought we were going to, throw them out and we were going to take over and all of that. So, yes. But then we published, and then there was the women's movement, the four women at Ackerman, who were just phenomenal, and they published their book, and we published a book on, and I think Imelda and they were at our conference
Hmm.
at Stonehenge. Um, so we it was the beginning of seeing how we didn't want to reverse it. I mean, there were many women who were just writing about coming to a place of gender equity,
Hmm.
gender equality, of social justice in gender. And that was in mid 1980s. And it's hard for me today to see that, we still have some of those struggles. We've come part of the way.
Yes, I was
But
going to ask you, sort of, having been involved in these kind of noticing these gender differences, these kind of inequalities. I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying about how you noticed it so dramatically in Morocco, with the man on the donkey and the woman kind of carrying behind, probably walking behind. But in a way, it sounds like from what you were saying in America, and of course, th those kinds of gender divide, divisions, inequalities were going on, but in a different kind of way. And you took again a very bold step of having this conference, which was women only. But I'm really curious what you're saying about how do you think where do you think the gender kind of divide or politics is now in family therapy?
It's more, I do mostly international work. Um, I I would say, well, in the US, we're having this regression with the election recently, and election and the appointment that's going to be of many men who have histories of sexual abuse, of terrible things. And that, it's women, the only ones that seem to be standing up about this are women. We are having debates about, um, healthcare, women's healthcare, women's bodies.
Mm,
So I I don't know. I would say in, I can't speak so much for family therapy, but I know these are things that are going on. There's two, maybe if we think systemically, we've pushed for several decades and there's some backlash now
mhm,
in many societies that, wait, maybe it's gone too far. And I know there's uh, the vice president of our country is, on record for saying, women should be at home having more children and raising more children.
mhm.
And that's the place of women. Men should be the breadwinners out there. So I think, just as a society, and then, um, these are questions about birth control, about choice, about family size that are coming in that I'm thinking more about. These are really dilemmas that have to do with, are we still defining child rearing and homemaking as what women are supposed to be doing? Or can we come to a place where men don't feel that they're diminished because women are advancing? I mean, there's this argument in the US about, well, men don't know who they are now. There's more women enrolled in college, going into graduate school. There seems to be, you know, for social justice that women get promoted. What about men? And there's kind of like, well, can't we all share and find an equitable way to relate to each other? And does one have to be down for the other one to be up? So I would say we're in a fraught play. Fraught was kind of the word of the year, I think.
Mhm, mhm. I'm I'm also wondering what it's where race, ethnicity was as well and is because I guess I'm sort of thinking about how you had your parents were kind of an intercultural, interreligious kind of couple, and you moved from Wisconsin, which I think you were saying was predominantly white, I'd imagine at that time, into California. Didn't is that where you were later on? And of course you've kind of gone to more diverse kind of places. So I'm wondering about, apart from the gender kind of dimensions that you were really grappling with and thinking together with your kinship. I'm wondering where you think and what kind of conversations you were having about race, ethnicity, particularly, I guess, in America, with the legacy of slavery and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, we have to have, I don't think we have today enough of a historical view. We're very much here and now, and even our methods are solution focused or remaking our narrative, our lives going forward, the chapters. And I think we really need more to learn from what's come before because, growing up as I did, and, Monica as well, and Carol lived in Minnesota. I mean, Kenosha was entirely white.
Mhm.
I remember one boy in fourth grade um, came in, and I'll say his name. It was, Jimmy Mason. I remember him because he was the only Black boy, and his family didn't stay very long because I don't know if it was the mafia, but the unions or whatever protected the job for people who were called ethnic white. And that meant, they were from Eastern Europe mostly. Their parents or grandparents had come as immigrants, and the jobs were protected for whites. So, they moved out of town. Even in California, there were neighborhoods, and I didn't know about redlining. I didn't know that blacks couldn't live in my neighborhood. I knew that Mexican Americans lived, one town over. I lived in the valley, so, each neighborhood had its own, ethnic.
Communities. Hmm.
And there was really a lack of meeting place, a lack of getting to know one another that I'm afraid with the pandemic and with the um, political polarizations that people have been retreating even more today
Hmm.
back into gated communities where they're fearful about others that aren't like them.
Hmm.
I was fortunate, just Morocco, just coming to love and really thinking about making my life permanently there. I loved it, and I just felt very much at home.
Was that your
Um,
first exposure to kind of a place that was so different in terms of culture,
I
religion?
That's true because even at the University of California,
Hmm.
at Berkeley, I didn't know there was only one Black person that I had any contact with. He was German, from an African German teacher of German when I was a senior in college, because until we had more diversity in bringing kids, from lower income communities. So fortunately, when I came back, I lived in New Haven. It was the time of the civil rights movement.
Hmm.
And I know Evan was very involved in it. I was very involved in it, all of us. And I would say that the 60s coming back to the US from Morocco was able to see and appreciate and become someone that I wanted to add my voice to give my actions for. So from my early 20s on, I would say, and I live in Chicago since, for 40 years now. And I love Chicago because it is such a diverse city in every respect. And I would say the main thing too is that I was a professor at University of Chicago for 25 years
Very long
in
time.
School of Social Work. I'm both a psychologist and a social worker. Same thing. I'm both. I
These
um
different facets of
I
you
don't
all
know.
kind
And
of,
I'm a family therapist. That psychologists and social workers, they're kind of like backing off from family therapy. I don't know,
yeah.
but being in a school of social work that at through all those decades, implicitly it's about person and environment and multi-level.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
so it was really a good home, but it also was on the south side of Chicago. I lived in Hyde Park. I had aunts and uncles in Chicago. Um, and it was and the students, my when my husband John Rowland and I opened Chicago Center for Family Health, all of us on the faculty had our primary commitment to underserved and marginalized persons and their families.
Hmm.
And that's just who we've always been. Particularly, we worked with the gay community through the AIDS crisis in the 90s. Um, and we did a lot of training of clinicians in inner city clinics, particularly around, since I was also teaching on loss, around traumatic deaths,
Hmm.
gun violence, unsafe neighborhoods, families that worried every day about their kids, their lives. So I
Really,
would say that's been in the fabric of my life for 40 years. So
yes, sort of really cutting edge. Um,
Mhm.
so when you were talking about the different kind of groups and communities that you've worked with, you were talking about working with very deprived, sort of economically disadvantaged kind of families, people suffering from AIDS, people uh, coming into your service through sort of victims of being of gun crimes. They're like very heavy, very, very traumatizing and traumatic kind of work. And I was wondering about what sustained you. And I mean, we talk now, don't we, about the impact of it, the vicarious kind of trauma for the clinicians, and the need to look after oneself. And so I was wondering what was sustaining you through this work.
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say, first of all, my family, my husband, my daughter. Um, Very proud of her. I, she's an only child because I started late as well. And she is blessed. We're so proud of her. She is now the global advisor for mental health and psychosocial services in humanitarian context with International Medical Corps, works with WHO and all the different international organizations for training. I love the way they think about it. It's all about training and capacity building
Mhm.
uh, in places in high need. She travels to really very hard places, Ukraine, and you know they work everywhere in the world, in Gaza and Sudan.
Wow.
So
Really
I would say,
tough places to be.
yeah, we're very close, and I do puppy sitting for her. She lives in New York now, and that's very nourishing. And my friends, I had a friend from college just call. That was the ringing you heard a few minutes ago. We touch base every few months, and um, I don't like the word retire. Um, my good friend Lorraine Wright, who was in Calgary.
Mhm.
I don't know if you knew her, she was fabulous. She did generations of nursing in family therapy training, and we ran into her in Southeast Asia, and she said, well, she retired from the university, which I did as well. I'm a emeritus status.
Mhm.
Um, but she said, like the word preferment, she's and
Rather
that
than
she
retirement.
yes, she does what she prefers to do, and so she goes around the world doing trainings of nurses in faraway places. And I think I think my mother always had a love of the world, and I love international training. I still do some writing, and um, uh, I was just in, actually, I mentioned because you asked about family therapy today, and I'm very discouraged about it in the US right now because it seems like there's a default in our water system back to the individual.
Mhm.
And we've always been on pathology and a movement of young people that if you had parents who hurt you in some way, you should just cut off from them and forget about it and go on with your life. And training being individualized and work with grief now being pathologized with this DSM label of prolonged grief disorder, that you have a mental condition if you are suffering from, a very maybe complicated death or a traumatic loss of a loved one. So I really value all of my international connections that and people that are working in disaster areas in Istanbul. I do some webinars with them, but I think most encouraging recently has been both in Asia, the Asian Academy of Family Therapy, and they just held their meeting in Shanghai. And I was hoping to go. It ended up I had to do a Zoom plenary with them. but I did go to Singapore. And I want to mention it because it was so uplifting to me that the government of Singapore, of course, it is an island that is a city, as a society. So, they can do things at a societal level, um, but it's multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-faith, very much inclusive as I've seen around. And this was a conference put on by the government Ministry for Social and Family Development for invited 400 delegates from the whole region in Asia,
Mhm.
to talk about how to have how to build strong and resilient families.
Right.
So here, the government commitment from the top down. So I gave the opening address for that. But just to hear how the government, they talk about upstreaming. I've never heard that in our country because there is no upstreaming that is family centered in any kind of work or community centered. So even the president of Singapore, uh, I had I attended a breakfast with ministers with the president,
Mhm.
where I thought, well, maybe he'll come and we'll have some polite conversation. It was a spirited discussion with him asking questions about changes in families in societies around the world and what to do about elders now who I mean, I
Wow.
did such a thing in my breakfast because to see this happening was just so amazing. And then he gave the opening remarks, and he stayed and listened to my opening talk. I have never been in a place where I've seen, and it isn't about me, it's about the commitment from the very top. And he said that, and they were repeating this, that families are the bedrock of society.
Mm.
That for a society to be strong, families must be strong. I was blown away
Mhm.
by this commitment. And I just wanted to mention it because, as I travel around, or I was in 2023 at the conference in Assisi, that the institute that is founded by Maurizio Andolfi in Rome. There were 1,200 excited younger people wanting to work with families
Mhm.
that were here at Assisi. The energy, the enthusiasm for work with families. So this is what keeps me energized.
Mhm.
Is I see that, and I want to, be there, and I want to support that next generation.
So your preferment is very busy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it has a little bit busy. Yeah.
I I wonder what's that been like for you? Because you're talking about sort of the more local kind of discourses about the individual, the kind of cutting off of ties with families if things have been difficult, and you then go to other kind of countries in other cultures and they're talking about the importance of the family. What is that like for you going, weaving sort of in and out between those different sort of contexts?
Isn't that my life?
You've had that a very early start with that.
That's what I'm about. And I'm always about both and
Hmm. Hmm.
always that there's an eye to, well, this is happening and this is happening.
Hmm. You've been
And
kind of knitting and weaving and stitching, and you're just kind of
I
continuing.
don't know.
What a tapestry you are weaving. I know I wanted to.
No, please don't give me the credit. It's like the tapestry, that is, I mean, another, I like very much Bill Madsen, who was a dear friend of mine, who we lost a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
He talked about mattering and what matters and who matters.
Mhm.
And that's why I know in the work that I do with loss and resilience, that part of it has energizes me when I see people who have suffered just unspeakable losses, able to not just survive, but to find meaning, to find new purpose in their life, to go out and dedicate their lives to helping other people.
Mhm.
Um,
I mean,
it's not about me. It's like I'm holding maybe and trying to support those who are
mm,
really trying to um, rise above, um, you know, tragedy and horrible things in the world, to not give up, not fall into victimhood, but to be able to go on, not just to thrive in their own personal life, but to bring some good to others. When I hear people say, we can't bring back what's happened, but I want something good to come out of this tragedy. I want to be part of that.
mhm,
And to me, that's the power of it.
mhm. Yeah, so you're sort of talking about these kind of challenges, but also something about um that holding of hope of something kind of really quite generative coming out from that. And I was just sort of thinking as someone who's been in the field of family therapy for a very long time and has shaped it as well, w along with other people, because I completely kind of get a sense of what's really important to you has been the relationships that you've kind of built with others, who you've kind of encouraged and have felt encouraged by in your development. But and I was just thinking about what are you seeing as some of the challenges in, for family therapy field, for family therapists now? What, someone who's kind of been here for quite some time, what are some of the challenges for contemporary family therapists?
Well, I mean, it's the challenges of the economics of being, being able to support yourself with what you do. If there's not reimbursement or there's not funding for research, that right now we're in still this, I don't know how much throughout Europe, but certainly in the US, this evidence-based practice where you have to, first of all, have funding, and then you have to have these large controlled studies that, and in psychology, the field of psychology in particular, um, and even in social work as well, to have for young people today, to have an academic position. Um, you can't just be building theory. You can't just be doing training. You have to be bringing in grants. You have to be having funding and doing these large scale research things that give you the kind of credit that's needed if you're going to advance your career and you're going to get tenure. This is a struggle. I was one of the founding people, along with several people I've mentioned in AFTA, American Family Therapy Academy. And, it's now at a place where, we valued this coming together once a year in these meetings. You have EFTA, I know you have meetings in the UK.
Mhm,
John and I presented in Edinburgh one year. Um, but those are really valuable in person, um, where I think I worry about everything being on the internet, being on social media, being on the phone. Here we are, and we're doing the best we can, and it's
yeah.
great.
Yes.
Um, it is great because you're a great person to have a conversation with. But to have this 2 hours to have an in-depth conversation, it doesn't happen enough.
Mhm,
People are overscheduled. The pressures of everyday life, of raising children in a world that demands more intensive parenting, more, obstacles on the way, that people are really struggling and coming out of the 3 year pandemic, where we really lost our bearings in a lot of depression, anxiety, uncertainty about the future, about climate change, about so much about war and conflict everywhere, about divisions in our societies and migration. I mean, there is so much that younger generation coming up has to be concerned about and has to navigate. I mean, if we talk, these are challenges. It's an awful lot, and uh, that's where, I don't want to retire. We can't. It's. I want to support. I want to be a support. It's going to be very challenging, I think, for the younger generation going forward.
Mhm. I mean, it's interesting you were talking about the younger generation because I was thinking about your daughter and sort of how she's in a similar kind of field to you, mental health and training and sort of doing things on a global kind of platform. And what kind of encouragement she must have kind of got from you and her father as well. And was thinking about what you think you've kind of done differently and carried through from your kind of parents in terms of your own family. So there's a bit of me that was thinking about that, and what you've kind of created anew and what kind of advice you'd give to your daughter about really sustaining oneself through these kind of, what you were talking about, these very challenging times.
Mhm.
And I was also thinking about you as an elder in the field and thinking about younger, sort of family therapists and what kind of advice you would give them, because there's something about how you entered into the field as a very young, you were in your 20s, you were talking about earlier. And you must have had to kind of sustain and kind of deal with some really difficult situations as you were talking about earlier, and what kind of what sustained you there. So yeah, I guess I'm trying to put two different things together, but maybe I ask you first of all, in terms of in terms of your own family, what do you think you've knitted differently, and what kind of message you think your daughter will get from you and her father?
Oh, she does. I think that was also a mistake in the earlier theory that you grow up and then you detach and you should be independent.
Mm,
Um, and actually, I had a fabulous mentor, Bert Kohler, who was at the University of Chicago. And it was really, when you talk about encouragement, there were men as well in my life who
mhm,
really encouraged me. He really encouraged me to go back when I had a master's degree, to go back and get a PhD. And, there, that he had done his own research in Boston in blue collar families. And he said, we got this wrong about you grow up and then you're on your own. He said, particularly in blue collar families, they see their mothers, they talk on the phone every day, they keep in touch. And I know I do that. My friends do that, especially with daughters. We notice there is a difference. And so we're lifelines. I like that word, lifelines.
mhm,
We're here. And, when the 2008 crash occurred, you know, some of them had to come home again. That was
mhm,
fine.
mhm.
They had to go back out again,
Yeah.
too. But I think life is harder for this generation overall.
Mhm,
And just paying the rent is hard.
mhm,
And if you're in a nonprofit field, humanitarian field, you know, paying the rent and living in she calls her apartment a shoebox, but she loves what she does. And, it's challenging. But I think just knowing that we have kin, friends, she has a large social network. Um, and I think that we need those connections and also spirituality. It's interesting because I know in northern Europe and UK. There was just an article that was published about spirituality in Denmark in one of your journals. Um, but uh, I remember presenting in Australia several years ago, and it was on resilience. And when I got to the part about spiritual resources, they said, you can skip that part because we're not religious here. That's not important to us. And I just think, my whole work has been about seeing spirituality as either within religion, which fewer people in most countries are finding today, and much more something both personal and transcendent
Mm,
that is
mm,
found in many varied ways. And I do think that we need to find those um, relational and spiritual ways of nourishing ourselves
mhm,
um, in order to not just survive, but to thrive in a world that's in turmoil. Maybe it always was.
mm,
I think it all, I think it always was, but with social media and politics, it's in our face all the time.
mhm.
And there's an urgency to it that I think is not helpful.
And what makes you hopeful about the field? I know you're talking about all of these challenges and in a sense that maybe these challenges have kind of just been there, but they change across the kind of age. But what gives you hope about the field? What sort of maybe you feel you're kind of wanting to see more of, or that you're feeling excited by? What are some of the developments in the field that's kind of making you hopeful?
Yeah, well, I think I've mentioned it that when I see young people, 1,200 people from all over Europe, and some came from Asia, because they want to work with families. They're excited about it.
Mhm,
They love the idea of systemic practice. It's going to be young people. And I mean, it's out of a cauldron of crisis and challenge that there's innovation.
mhm,
When people have a placid, that's where in my early work, it was on so-called normal family processes. And that word, I was all about deconstructing normality
mhm,
because, there is no cookie cutter way you should be or is best to be or healthy to be. But in those days, the focus in deciding what was healthy was if you middle class and you had enough money and everything was going along okay. But innovation comes out of adversity. So I guess we have to not sink into hopelessness. I like the word. There's several people around the world whose work I continue to read and be inspired by. And Kata Weingartner's work about practicing hope. It isn't something that we are sitting in our room of despair and being upset and angry at larger forces, but it's practicing hope by active engagement, active involvement that makes us want to work harder, makes us want to go around the side, over the top, underneath,
mhm,
that perseverance, the initiative and the perseverance, and just a conviction that resilience is something it's a human capacity, and maybe it sometimes forces us uh, to do things that we wouldn't have had to do if life was just calm and pleasant.
mm. Well, I think we could carry on talking and talking. There's just so much to kind of unpack here. But it's very interesting how we've come in some ways full circle to the beginning of our conversation, where you're talking about sort of out of struggles come these kind of opportunities to practice hope and innovation and to kind of, to develop resilience and the importance of relationships, that are so key or have been so key to your kind of life, how these different kind of relationships have had, of course, the capacity to kind of bring up pain and suffering, and also yet heal and kind of be the kind of the bedrock. I think you used another word, didn't you? You said lifelines.
Mm.
For yeah, lifelines for transformation and sort of, repair as well.
For holding through hard times too.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
I think that would be the other danger in our field if we, because we can only work in a short time, are so focused on solving problems and solutions. Like, a tragic death and loss, you can't bring that person back.
Mm,
And you
mm,
can't just jump over how did it used to be and how can we make it happy again. And those are very superficial
mm.
and faulty notions of resilience. It's not don't worry, be happy, just make a new life.
Yeah.
As therapists, as people living at this time, we have to experience the grief, the sadness, and we have to, as therapists, be comfortable and provide a safe haven for our clients. And we have to be able to bear it
Mhm, mm.
and yet not sink into it, help them then to rise out.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm wondering what this experience of having the conversation has been like for you, whether there have been any kind of surprises or any connections with particular aspects of because we've covered so much in terms of, from the time you were very young, coming right up to, you know, current time. And yeah, I'm just wondering, in sort of going back and coming forth, what that's been like for you.
It's energizing for me, and it makes me want to just keep on keeping on. And it makes me want to know you better. And I hope that I'll meet you in person someday. I don't know where or when, but every time I open my email, you never know.
Definitely. I mean, I have really, really been so moved by how you embody what you talk about, what you kind of speak about, what you do, that sort of sense of both and, but also these different kind of complexities and different kind of dimensions, these kind of different aspects of your legacies from your parents, the the gender difference, the hope and despair, the trauma and adversity and resilience. You really embody that sort of sense of being able to hold these so many different kind of might feel as though they're contradictory and
Thread.
opposing.
They're all threads, I
Yeah.
guess. And they're all there. And then, like Bill Madsen said, life is messy. My narrative friends, Jill Friedman, Jean Combs, they're part of our center.
Mhm.
Life is messy, and that is the way it is. And I don't know. But also, let me say, I've gotten old. And if you had talked to me 20 years ago, I don't know more than I did 20 or 40 years ago. When I look back, I probably was saying the same thing. But maybe I do think that maybe it's more of a spiritual, I'm a little bit more Buddhist than than I was when I was younger, and kind of like coming to see, um, I hope I'm around longer, and I hope that, everyone out there carries us further.
Well, thank you so much for your passion and your energy. And it does feel like your preferment is going to, I hope, carry on for a very long time, and that there's so many more gifts that you will be offering to us as you go along. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was just delightful. Thank you.